I te whānau, we're going to go into our next section of Te Whare Orono. Our kai kōrero, our next kai kōrero is Whaia Debri Wiri, he uri no Ngāre Raumati, Ngāpuhi, Ngāti Awa, me te whānau Āpanui. Whaia Deb is a brainwave trust kaiako who travels across the motu, working with whānau, supporting them to do what they need to do for their self-determine their lives. Today, Des will be taking us through what happens to the brain when trauma happens and trauma occurs. So we're going to introduce you to Whaia Deb.
E kore au, e ngaharo, he kakano, I rui a mai, I rangi a te a, I rui a mai, I rangi a te a. Ahi Māori ki a koutou katoa. Ai, ko te taku ingoa. Before I begin to talk about how trauma affects the developing brain, I really want to talk about the context or the concept of our mokopuna, our babies. And this is through evidence-based research, this is through anecdotal and also practice-based research. So when Pākehā arrived here, some of their observations of our tupuna were that our babies were well loved and cared for by the whole village. And our wahine, some of the statements made was that neither of them had a mark upon them of violence. Samuel Marsden said in 1814, these have to be the most amazing children in the world, because of how they are and how they present themselves to the world. And so I want to build that context first before we even launch into looking at trauma, because obviously for us, our tikanga was premised off how well we cared for our mokopuna, our babies, in a way that they felt like they were part of an emergent cultural society, but also that they were deemed to be special. And how do you think that feels for every child born into a village to be able to feel like they are first and foremost the most important person there? So important. And I remember Te Horo, he's a taonga puoro expert, and he said, when a baby, he found this information in the archives, and he said when a baby was born in the village, they would take out the taonga and they would bang it on the ground and say, "Anei he mokopuna anō." So thanking Papa Tuanuku around the provision of another baby, because they were always accepted and wanted. Now, when you think about how Pākehā perceived us, and these are whalers, sailors, missionaries, Cook, when he came into the Bay of Islands, how they perceived us and how we lived was really premised off the values and belief system that they had come from in England, that said if you were married, you basically owned your wife and she was your property, and so were the tamariki. So they came here, and it was a little bit discombobulating because what they saw was a whole different system. It was a system where the manaki, to uplift the mana of the people that were there. And so uplifting the mana of our tamaiti. And if you think about it, our process of conservation, of caring for the environment, te taiao, is so closely connected to how we cared for our babies, for our mokopuna. So you can't have, a construct that says, oh, you look after the environment, but you don't look after the tangata. It is just a given that will happen too. So it's within that context that I want to begin this conversation, because we know how colonisation and assimilation has really disoriented our people and has created huge trauma with our tupuna. But when we think about the brain, we think about how do we genetically inherit some of those memories within our cellular structure. And that is the key thing that we are going to look at today. One of the processes I want to do, and I always describe it like this. So in our brain, we have a seesaw, and the seesaw is called the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. And so when our babies are upset, okay, they elevate their stress response system, as I'm describing here with my hand. When they elevate that, what they need is a calm, reassuring voice to help them calm down. Okay, babies cannot do that on their own. And so when I describe how do babies let us know what they want, what they need, actually babies cry. That's their alarm system telling us that they need something. And actually for the tangata, for the whānau, it's about us reading their responses. If we attune to them, and that just means that the mama and the papa get really engaged with noticing their cues. Now, pre-colonisation, we lived in villages. So what you had was 4 adult brains looking after one little brain. But through industrialisation, that created nuclear families. And therefore we grew up in separate homes and we didn't have that supportive environment around us. So consequently, it led to a lot of stress, because what you had was generally a stay-at-home mama, and the papa was going out to work because industrialisation had happened. And so it began the breaking down of our normal societal structures. And then we have, once we've created this nuclear family, because I just want to say something. I remember Bruce Perry, he's a neuropsychiatrist who works in the States. And he said, he was being interviewed, and he said Indigenous cultures had it down pat because of this process of the village raising the baby. We didn't have SIFs or rangatamariki. We were that. We monitored that whole process around what was happening within that system or that construct that we'd created, mai rānō. And I just want to say this, when Captain Cook sailed in 250 years ago, he didn't discover us, he didn't discover this whenua, he discovered us, and we'd been domiciled here for over 1,000 years. An archaeologist said to me one day, we've discovered a taonga that we've carbon dated to 850 years. And I said, well, thanks for that. You know, whakapapa tells us we've been here for 1,000 years. And he said to me, I'll let you have that, Deb. And I said, wasn't asking for it. But it's interesting for me that until we get the validation of Western science that actually uplifts and says, well, actually, this culture already knew how to behave with babies. They already knew how to create relationship that was premised off loving, nurturing, responsive, engaging whānau systems. And why I want to say that is because quite often we look at a culture in its deficits instead of the opportunities that it creates to grow the potential. Now, our tupuna were of a growth mindset. And I remember something that Sir Mason Jury wrote. And he said, Māori are naturally centrifugal thinkers. Interesting word, isn't it? But what he said was that we wind up and we wind down. We don't think in a linear way. And so when I heard Koha speaking this morning, I thought, well, that's my kōrero. You know, what have I got to add to this? So we are going to look at this trauma. We've got colonisation happening. we've got assimilation happening, the breaking down of all the structures that we had in place. So whenua is taken, the reo is stripped away, and suddenly we become imbued into another way of thinking. That has to cause trauma. Trauma that's embedded in the very cellular structure of a brain and in the memory centres of not only our brain, but our cellular system. Okay, so early trauma. When we think about a baby, if something is happening in that household, and I always talk about this whole process of whether a baby's growing up in a nurturing, loving environment, or whether they're growing up in a war zone, which we can say with domestic violence, alcohol and drug addiction, any other things that they're growing up with, obviously the brain grows within that environment, because the first function of the brain is to actually survive that environment. And so it will continue to grow. Then what we have is, if that brain is growing in that environment, obviously it is going to attune itself to that. And so if a baby was looking at me and this was a loving, trusting, nurturing environment, then that's the type of environment it will expect out there. Are they going to be let down? Of course they are. The world is not a perfect place. There are no perfect parents, and we all make mistakes. And so understanding that whole concept really helps us to understand human beings and human behaviour. So remember, I talked about the stress response system. The more we can help the baby to regulate their stress response system, the more we bring them back to us into a state of calm, the ability for them to begin to trust their environment with the people that are nurturing them and helping them to survive. So I want to talk about when in our memory centres, we have several, but I'm going to talk about implicit memory and explicit. So implicit memory is unconscious memory. And in unconscious memory, again, the expression is that babies absorb memory, but they absorb it through their sensory system. And we know that for us in Te Ao Māori, we talk about the 5 sensory systems, but actually we do have another one. And it's really an opportunity for us to acknowledge. Our tupuna talked about the activation of Māori once a baby was born. They already knew that they had wairua intact, in place, imbued inside of them. And so when that wairua is intact and the birth process means that Māori is activated, then we know that we've got a sensory system that has 6 significant things that babies are picking up through their senses. And so the importance of that is when you think about what they're picking up through their environment, which is actually helping to shape them. Yes, they inherit their DNA from both their parents, but actually that environment is helping to shape them too. So what does this mean? If the environment is helping to shape them, then you as whānau workers, when you're working alongside our whānau and their tamariki, how do you get alongside of them? And I heard this kōrero just before we went into a break around having, first and foremost, sometimes I think we focus on the problem too hard and too much. The ability to actually look at how our whānau systems have managed to survive wherever they've come from. If we're respectful and responsive, if we have empathy and compassion on board, then the ability for us to get alongside whānau means that they begin to trust us. So whānau workers, the ability of you to develop trust with the whānau is actually just your process of accepting them for where they're at. Then you can have the courageous conversations. So we hear this term, courageous conversations. And if we know that in the neural pathways of the brain, if trauma is embedded, there's a myriad of ways it gets activated. So for small babies, they can't actually get away. So they're in their, they may be in their cots, but they can't move. So in terms of what happens for them, they somehow shut their whole system down. So when they do that, we may have babies that don't even cry. Because if you've set off your alarm system that says, please come to me, I need help, and they don't get that reciprocal feedback from the people that are supposed to care for them and love them, then basically they'll stop setting off their alarm system. Okay. For small children, when we think about what happens for them, you know, there might be inappropriate behaviour. We tend to notice for boys when they're young, they might be, the term that's used is hypervigilant or hyper-aroused. And what that means is that they find it really difficult to calm themselves. Because the ability to calm yourself, you cannot teach 101 empathy. Empathy is modelled, it's not taught. And so to model empathy, they have to have a repetition of this process over and over and over again. Because what that's doing is myelinating the pathways in their brain. When I talk about it, really what we're trying to do is lower their stress response so that they don't need to elevate their stress time and time again. You will never ever, can't do it, won't work, spoil a baby. Because babies let us know what they want through the process of crying. And you know, they get to the point when we've attended to them often over again and again that they might go, eh, and mama says, I'll come to you. So that's lowering their stress response system. So children have a myriad of ways. There's a whole continuum of behaviour. We know that abuse and neglect affects neural pathways. Remember I said the brain will continue to grow. But if a child is being abused or neglected, then that's going to create some internal trauma for them. And these terms that I use around hypervigilance and hyper-aroused, you know, that's in the DSM-5, that the psychopathy. But if we think about our tupuna, how did they deal with a tamaiti that was unsettled? Well, generally, they actually knew that that transmission of energy was not good for them. So we had a practice, and it was with a kaumātua down in Uawa. And what he said was that, you know, Whai Deb, I don't know what oxytocin means. Oxytocin is the love hormone. And he said, when we work the marakai, so those are the village gardens, if anyone was carrying any hara, any bad feelings, he said they were not allowed to work in the marakai. But he said the other thing, they were not allowed to handle the babies. And so what we understand from that is that our tupuna already understood the transmission of energy. They didn't need to be taught that. They already understood it. Okay, so getting back to trauma. How do you work with a whānau when you can clearly see that there's something that's actually interrupting that close connection that you hope to build with, you know, with that whānau, but also watching how the mama and the papa and the whānau begin to get alongside of them. Remember I said, accepting them where they're at. That means we might have to park up our own judgments, because we will have those judgments. We put them aside. We go in there, and we don't start first with asking. You don't ask them. You just say things like, look, I noticed when you were holding, just as an example, when you were holding baby and feeding her or him, that you had your phone in front of you, and you were looking at the phone, and baby was looking at you. What do you think she's trying to translate to you? What is she trying to do? And so what you're always doing is building what they already have, their strengths, and then getting them to reflect upon what it is they're doing. They are not a problem to be fixed, okay? So they have their own unique understanding of who they are and how they are. And so be respectful, be responsive. You know, make sure that your compassion and empathy are online, but you can't kidda. So be real, because being real or authentic, as we say, is really your inroad into being able to working more effectively with whānau when they're struggling with the issues that they may be struggling with. And that may mean, again, that we have to address our own hara. We may have to address, and I'm not saying, you know, we work through our life's journey trying to correct the things, the mistakes that we've made as a living human being. But the ability to actually, it is a gift for you to be inside a whare. It is a real gift that the whānau let you in there. So never ever take that for granted. Make sure that you are uplifting everything that they see and they do. You know, Bruce Perry again, he said, neglect happens mostly from ignorance. And if we know that, you know, the information we give them has to actually fit where they're at. Not that I'm going to teach you, because what the first thing we have to say is, you are the expert in your baby, not me. I might have some knowledge about neuroscience, and I might have some knowledge about how children develop and grow. I might have a huge knowledge base about that, but this is your baby. And then once you step that in an authentic space, our whānau begin to understand and know that you are genuinely in there to support them. So yeah, I think that's what I want to say. And I don't know that if there's any more. I'll look at my notes. I did write some notes down, but I've left them off now. So what I want you to think about as whānau workers is, what are you going to do with your new learning, with the things that I've shared with you today? And not only me, everybody else who's been here and had the ability to share some of the knowledge that they have. What are you clear about now, and what do you want to put in place? So how are you, moving forward, going to support the whānau that you're working with? How are you feeling? And reflecting on what you've heard, and how do you share this? How do you share it in your teams? How do you share it with your own whānau? And how do you share it when you go out and you're working alongside whānau to uplift them? And what opportunities and possibilities do you see, that is there for you to continue in this really cool mahi? I want to say it's the greatest gift we can have in working alongside whānau is that they actually let us in there. And I think if you remember that as being one of the key approaches, that it's a gift that they've given you to allow you to come into their space. And so I have a poem that I want to read, and it's from it's from Linda Tuhiwai Smith, and one of our whānau, our aunties died just recently, and her mokopuna read it, and I think it encapsulates. It is about wahine Māori, but I think it encapsulates, you know, women, man's included, and women, so it includes all of us. She walks with the power of thousands of years in her cycles of blood and the rhythms of her heart. She descends from the seas of Rangiatia, the never-ending source of who we are, who we can be. Don't mess with the Māori woman who stands beside you as she walks with the power of thousands of years in her blood and her bones. She breathes the salted air from the greatest ocean, from legendary voyagers, risk-takers, storytellers and lovers, from composers, mischief makers, scientists and warriors, from those who could intercede with the gods, our ancestors, who predicted our future and changed the course of our destiny. Don't mess with the Māori woman who walks alongside you as she walks with the power of thousands of years in her blood and her bones. So kia ora tātou. Thank you again for the opportunity to allow me to speak to you today. So kia ora tātou. I thank you again. Ka kite.
Whānau, nā mihi nui ki a tātou. E kore e wimiti te aroha ki a koe whaia Deb. What an awesome kōrero. I'm always learning something new every time, that you can't spoil a baby, and the best thing we can do is just listen to our whānau and where they're at. So we've got a few pātai whaia Deb. Our first pātai from Lena is tauiwi. How can we respect shared mātauranga Māori with Māori whānau?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and that you're reflecting upon that, because I know that one of the key things for our whānau is that they don't want someone from another culture telling them how their culture behaves, and so I'd be cautious. It's not to say don't speak it, but ask them what they know, you know, rather than feeling like you have to fill the space. Ask them what they know already about mātauranga Māori. And even if they say, I don't know anything, begin to start talking to them about, well, how was it with your grandparents? How was it with your aunts and uncles? So what you're already doing is embedding that, yeah, they had mātauranga Māori, even if they weren't connected to a marae, you know, even if they didn't have close whānau connects, maybe they'll be able to share that with you. And I think that's where you prompt it. You take it from them rather than feeling like you have to fill the space, you let them.
Ka pai. And one of our kaimahi, Joe, talks about how how Joe loves the kōrero around they are the experts of their baby. Yeah, and reminding them that they are the experts. You know, it's to whakamana them.
No.
Another pātai is, what are some practical advice we can do in our practical around helping whānau who operate in a stress response majority of the time, to then be able to help pepe calm
Their stress
responses, yeah.
Okay, this is part and parcel, because you're allowed to come into the whānau home, is that you model that behaviour, so that if mama's really stressed, you know, because baby's picking up, remember, they've got 6th century processes going on for them, and so when baby comes to you, and that you begin to model that calming process, you may pick up the baby, rock the baby, do all these things, so you're modelling that. And then ask the mama, what did you notice? What did you notice when you know, I picked baby up? Oh, well, she was quiet, you know. So it may not work all the time, but just be persistent in doing that. And I always say it's sort of like when you model the behaviour, you know, you're not saying to them they can't do it, but you're asking them what did they notice. And then, you know, say to them, here, you know, this is your baby, this is your pepe. And so you're giving, you know, the mana back, well, the honour back to them, because it's not saying, you know, I'm the only one that can do this. I can bring the baby back to calm. Like, you model that behaviour, but you always uplift the whānau.
Is the trauma inherited by our babies through DNA or the way we nurture them?
It is complex. The brain is a complex organ, and also it's this is a term we use, multifactorial. And so all that means is that there's a lot of things that play into it. And so you think about the DNA, you know, there's a new field of research looking at epigenetics and how memories can be transferred from one generation to another. But we're looking at the environment that this baby's growing up in. We're looking at the, you know, the relationship between their whānau, in their whānau system. We're looking at a whole lot of different aspects. What's the emergent personality of that particular child? You know, how attuned is the mama or the papa to the baby? Is there something else that's going on? So you can't just pick one thing and say, you know, that's what it is. It's, when I say it's multiple factors that actually interact with the environment that give us a key to understanding what's going on for the babies. Can you change it? Yes, you can. You know, because the brain is neuroplastic, and what that means is we have the opportunity and the ability, whilst they're young, to be able to support whānau to make some of those significant changes. Remember, they're taking the lead. We're supporting them. And so when you do that, what the baby begins to get, or the child, is a repetition of a different way of being. The longer we wait for them to age, the more challenging it becomes to change behaviour. But we have got a window of opportunity at this really foundational stage to be able to do that.
Another pātai, and I like this one because I think I'm the not the rea ho, but the Macy Rika in any of my mokopuna's lives. A kaimahi asks, I have a kaimahi that sings so beautifully. I think her singing to whānau would be a blessing to whānau. Great regulator.
Fantastic regulator. You know, we draw down endorphins. These are the happy hormones. And when we draw those down, you know, for whānau, even if you're singing flat, like sing, does that mean my baby will sing flat? Probably. But it doesn't matter, because the fact that you're singing, what you're doing is actually helping them to not only draw down these happy hormones like endorphins, but you're also helping them to relax. Like, you know, I don't see anyone who's angry singing, unless it's heavy metal. But, you know, those are the things that really will help. Play, singing, laughter, all of those things. It shouldn't be so heavy, whānau.
And we also know, especially after when Pepe is born, that Pepe's, you know, that parent or that whānau, the kaitaki voice, are the Beyoncés, are the Macy Rikas. So even if you're flat, your Pepe thinks you've got the best voice in the world.
That's
so
right.
kia kaha te waiata whānau, because our babies are so clever and they think your voice is the most protective voice, so they'll be happy e whaiti. But that's one thing I learned when I first got into the space. Another pātai is connections. Connecting with whānau and tamariki at a place or level where everyone is on the same page and level. We are all here for the same reason.
Ai, kia ora, kia kaha with that. Sometimes you may not be on the same page or the same level, but it requires us as whānau workers to actually step back and become more responsive to where they are. Remember, hold your judgments, but actually leave them in the door when you cross the threshold, because, you know, you will begin to start to attune to them rather than thinking they've got to attune to you. And it's honouring them.
Another pātai whaia, Deb, what would your 5 tips be for growing a healthy, awesome pepe brain?
So I spoke about responsive, respectful relationships. You know, as I said, no one's perfect. We all make mistakes, and the world is not a perfect place. And so understanding what your own process around healing, maybe some of your early trauma is. And the more you can do that, the more availability you have to your babies. So remember to laugh and play. Play is the unfolding of personhood. It is about connecting with our tamariki in a way. And I remember reading this listener article, and it said, you know, a priest down in Opotiki, he wrote back to his Monsignor in France, and he said, what am I going to do with these natives? All they do, all day, their children, they run around laughing and singing like it was a crime. And, you know, the Monsignor sent him back some advice how to get them into church. And so I remember this, and he offered them a coin. He said, if you come to church, I'll give you a coin. Well, this is how smart those tamariki were in Opotiki. So they walked into the church, he gave them a coin each, and then they turned around at the font and walked back out, and he said to them, hey, I've paid you to come in. And they said, yeah, we came in. Isn't that so cute? And so for me, it's sort of like, that's how clever they were. You know, we think that children have to be in front of devices or things, but actually the best learning they're ever going to get is when they're in front of brains that actually relate to them, that have a responsive relationship with them. That is the key. So kia kaha, kia maia, kia manawa nui.
I te whānau, tēnei te mihi kia koe whaia, Deb, e kore e mimiti te aroha kia koe. You're always here when we need you, and it's always awesome to support our whānau that are talking to whānau, that are in homes, supporting the growth of our mokopuna, supporting play, supporting whakapapa, supporting building new tipuna for the future. It's always about legacy, Whaia Deb, every time I hear.
So much.
Some of the things that I heard Whaia Deb's is around, you know, first contact of European and how they saw our whānau, our fathers carrying our babies, really caring about our whānau and the love and care they had for not just mokopuna, but for our mamas and our kuia and stuff like that. But how colonisation affected and traumatised our whānau. And that really, one that I really loved was look at where the whānau are at, supporting whānau where they're at, not where everyone else is at. And our tipuna had so many strategies around care.
So many.
So that was really awesome to hear. And it's a gift for us to go into kaina. So make sure that we're supporting and really going in with authentic feelings and big aroha. We've talked about aroha all day today and making sure that we're leaving that space in aiho, in a space of calm. So whānau, tēnei te mihi kia koutou, e te whaia, e kore me te aroha, tēnā koe, aro ki te hā.